Biblical Hebrew was the spoken language of the Jewish people for over 1,000 years. In the year 70 AD, the Hebrew language basically died out. However, in the year 1881, there was a gentleman with the name Eliezer ben Yehuda who revived the Hebrew language. And had it not been for this guy who's put in all the efforts to make a language that was basically a read-only language, part of the Jewish culture again, we would not only not have a modern Jewish state, but we would not have been able to dig into ancient Hebrew. So this fascinating piece of history is what brings us to today. We will look at the context of Hebrew. Where does Hebrew fit into the timeline? And what do we make of ancient Hebrew? And what do we do with this very fascinating shift that God allowed to happen to the ancient Hebrew alphabet that became a modern Assyrian script, which is still in use today, as we've discussed in the intro. My name is Helmut Meijer. I'm your host, but also your fellow scholar. Let's dig straight into the story of Biblical Hebrew. If we have to take a very reductionist view of the history of the Jewish people, or shall we say the history of the evolution of the Hebrew language, then a basic summary would be as follows. From the best archaeological evidence that we have, Hebrew started functioning as a, shall we say, a written or a spoken language around 1000 BC. And that lasted until the majority of the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon in 586 BC. And as you know, when they returned from Babylon, there was another script in play. So today we sit with a dilemma. If we contextually look at ancient Hebrew, there used to be a Paleo-Hebrew script. Some people also talk about the Proto-Canaanite script, and there's various pieces of fantastic information, links below, that you can study to understand what was the main influences of the Paleo-Hebrew script. You must remember the Hebrew story starts with a guy called Abraham, whom God has called out of Babylon. He eventually went to a place called Haran and then moved south to the land of Canaan. By the way, the land Canaan comes from the Hebrew word Canaan, which means the land below. And Abram is the first guy ever to be called a Hebrew. Now, the Hebrew word for the word Hebrew is Ifrit. And Ifrit comes from the verb avar, which means to cross over. So a gentleman like Abram crossed over the river from the north, from the land of Haran, into the land of Canaan, and he became a Hebrew. The start of our story with ancient Hebrew basically starts with Abram entering the land of Canaan. And this is not a Hebrew history lesson, but just so that we have a kind of a bird's eye view of how the Hebrew language works, we need to understand that the story basically starts with Abraham. And then it develops through the time of the patriarchs, through the kings, of which David probably is one of our keeping figures, who has written obviously and probably most of the Psalms in a pictographic script. Then the story continues. And God allows the Jewish people to be exiled to the land of Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in Hebrew, it's a word called Nebuchadnezzar. It's a difficult word, but we'll get around to that. So Nebuchadnezzar then brings the Jewish people to the land of Babylon, and you know the history. For 70 years, a lot of changes happen, not only to the Jewish people, not only to their worldview, but they come back and their pictographic Hebrew script, their pictographic alphabet, has now transformed into what is called the Babylonian flame script. And interestingly, up to this day, the Babylonian flame script or the Assyrian script is still in use. Now, why is this important? On the one end, when you look at the pictographic script, it gives us pictures, it gives us something tangible to understand the nomadic worldview. Now, one thing we must be very honest about, it wasn't only the Hebrew people that had been nomads. Remember, Canaan, the land of Canaan, was full of other people. Were they real people? Were they Nephilim? That we'll discuss in another playlist. Bottom line is, The language we call Biblical Hebrew was inspired by a number of nations surrounding the land of Canaan, or Canaan, land below. I'm thinking of the Palestinians, I'm thinking of the Phoenicians. A lot of scholars believe that the Phoenicians were the main influences of what we call Biblical Hebrew. And therefore, if we look at the Proto-Canaanite or the Phoenician script, we find something that scholars agree on had been the pictographic script that connect the ancient world to the modern world. And with modern world, I'm not talking about these days. I'm talking post the Babylon of the Jewish people. So from this point onward, we will now assume a timeline that stretches from Abraham to roughly 586 BC. That period of time is when the pictographic script developed and had been in use. And then after they've returned from their exile from Babylon, we have another script called the Babylonian flame script or the Assyrian script. And both of these are important. But in a sense, the ancient pictographic script, the gift of that is the pictures that help us to understand a nomadic worldview. And on the other end, the modern or the more modern Babylonian flame script help us to understand the numerical mysteries of the language. And I think God uses both. I think there are dangers in both. I think both are open-ended to making incorrect deductions of the language. But for context, we need to understand that the history and the evolution of the Hebrew language has a pictographic origin, and eventually it ends up in a script of which Jesus, for example, refers to in Matthew 25, where he says, not a tittle or a yod would disappear from the Torah until everything is fulfilled. And that tittle and yod he is referring to is actually speaking about the modern Babylonian flame script. So contextually, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a language that has a strange history, influenced and syncretized by all the nations around what we call modern-day Israel today. And it eventually then evolved to a script which was used to translate the Bible, the same source text that you and I use today.